Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Franklin Roosevelt, and the focus is marriage evolution and first national campaign. The year is 1916. Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt had been married about 11 years. They had brought 6 children into the world. You had Anna, and then James, then Franklin Jr., the first Franklin Jr., who died in infancy. That was followed by Elliott. Then another Franklin Jr. arrived as child number 5, and the last was John, who was born in March of 1916. At that point, Eleanor Roosevelt was done. No more children. She didn't want any more. And since she didn't know much about birth control, as we understand it, she chose abstinence. And this would be start of that evolution in the marriage of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. According to Anna, after John's birth, that was the end of any marital relationship, period. According to Elliott, my parents never again lived together as man and wife. They stayed married, but increasingly they were apart. They grew into different interests, and it wasn't just about the intimacy that was sort of being cut off. They really did start moving down the path of living separate lives, which would continue to divide, really, as their marriage would continue going forward. Now, in the last episode, at the end, we talked about Franklin Roosevelt going to Europe at the end of World War I. It's in the summer of 1918. On his return, look, there was a global pandemic of influenza going on during World War I. An influenza outbreak hit that ship that they were coming back on, devastating. Many sailors actually died en route, and Roosevelt caught the flu. He turned into double pneumonia. When he got back to New York, they had to take him off the ship on a stretcher. He was brought to Sara's home and tried to do some convalescing there. Eleanor was unpacking his things, and in those things she found a trove of letters that turned out to be love letters from a young lady by the name of Lucy Mercer. Now, Lucy Mercer was Eleanor's part-time social secretary. She was only 23 years old. When war broke out, she actually volunteered to join the Navy, became the personal secretary of FDR. Longer hours together turned into a full-blown affair. Now, Elliott, the son, was not surprised about this. He said, in the new circumstances of father's life at home, I see it as inevitable that they were irresistibly attracted to each other. But for Eleanor, this was a pretty big shock. She said, the bottom dropped out of my own particular world. I faced myself, my surroundings, my world honestly for the first time. She threatened divorce. She was going to leave Franklin Roosevelt, but then stepped in his mother, Sara, and also Louis Howe, and said, look, if you divorce, that's going to be the end of your political career. That was sort of the status quo at the time. So they talked it out and agreed that in the end, Franklin Roosevelt would no longer see Lucy Mercer. He would cut that off. They would stay married, but again, a very different kind of marriage, according to Elliott, who said, look, they struck up a partnership agreement. This partnership was to last all the way through their life. It became a very close and very intimate partnership of great affection, never in a physical sense, but in a tremendously mental sense. But there were very few light moments. They never enjoyed anything in the way of lightheartedness in their lives. Again, a different kind of marriage, much more of a partnership, mutually supporting, respectful, but mostly separate lives, much more of a partnership than a marriage. Now, Roosevelt was healthy enough to return to work in October. The armistice ending World War I signed on November the 11th. Roosevelt's back to Europe. He is the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He's going to lead the demobilization effort. He's got to focus on personnel, the ships, munitions, even radio stations had to either be sold or undone. Headquarters for Roosevelt doing this activity was in Paris at the same time that the peace talks were going on. And President Woodrow Wilson leading the American delegation personally at those peace talks in Paris. And Roosevelt largely stayed out of the way of that. He had a job to do and he remained focused. But when Wilson was heading back to the United States midway during these peace talks, because he had to attend to the end of Congress, had some bills to sign or veto, and Roosevelt hitched a ride on the way back to the United States. Now, Wilson on the ship mostly kept to himself, but at one point he did invite the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Roosevelt, to his cabin where they had lunch together, and mostly they talked about the League of Nations. This was so critical to Woodrow Wilson. In fact, he was conceding some of his so-called 14 points that were sort of the guiding principles for Wilson in both winning the war and winning the peace in terms of World War I. He was willing to give up on some of those to get the premiers of Europe from the Allies to agree to have this League of Nations, which he saw as really the ultimate answer on how to avoid these kinds of wars in the future. Now, he was willing to give in to some of the demands of the fellow premiers leading the nations in Europe, but one thing Wilson did not do, he didn't bring the political opposition, the Republicans from the United States, into this mix at all. And Franklin Roosevelt thought this was a political blunder. This was a mistake, and it actually turned out to be a real problem for Wilson, because the Republicans, who had to ratify any treaty, now had a majority in the Senate. Getting to a 2/3 supermajority to approve the Treaty of Versailles that Wilson eventually signed was kind of a tall order. And by ignoring the Republicans, they had different points of view on this. Look, the League of Nations would go into effect, but the United States would never join, in part because Woodrow Wilson was unable to get an agreement with the Senate that rejected that treaty on a couple of occasions, including after he had this massive stroke while he was out in the country trying to rally the country to support the League of Nations, and he remained an invalid the rest of his presidency and really the rest of his life. Treaty of Versailles would pass, it would be signed, but it would never be ratified by the United States Senate, and the U.S. would never join the League of Nations. All of this was relevant for Roosevelt heading into the election year of 1920. So Wilson was going to stand down, wide open for Republicans and Democrats. Louis Howe, again, always looking for political opportunities for Roosevelt. They had kind of passed on the New York governorship in 1918. They're thinking, what could come around here maybe at the national level in 1920? Well, one of the possibilities was maybe a presidential ticket that had Herbert Hoover and Franklin Roosevelt together. Now, who was Hoover at the time? Well, he was a war hero, not from fighting, but he was basically the man who kept the entire nation of Belgium from starving. He also was the U.S. Food Administrator during the war, so very well-known, very popular. Nobody really knew whether he was a Republican or a Democrat. He had never held political office before, but both parties were kind of after him, and Roosevelt actually had a meeting with him, and they talked over the potential ticket, came away from that, and Roosevelt said to his friend Louis Wheely, Hoover's certainly a wonder. I wish we could make him president of the United States. There could not be a better one. Well, just a few days later, Hoover did enter a primary in California, his home state, as a Republican. And by the way, this would be about the last time Hoover and Roosevelt were aligned on anything for the rest of their lives. Now, Hoover was just one of many who was up for the 1920 Republican nomination. He did not get that nomination. In fact, none of the frontrunners actually made it through, so they went with a dark horse. Warren Harding of Ohio, a senator, was actually the Republican nominee. As for the Democrats, they were meeting in San Francisco for their convention. The leaders going in were William McAdoo, the former Treasury Secretary, also A. Mitchell Palmer, who was the current Attorney General, might get the nomination. Franklin Roosevelt was there to place Al Smith's name into nomination, Smith being the governor of his home state of New York. Also, the Ohio governor, James Cox, was in the mix. 40 ballots later, it was Cox who emerged as the nominee. Now, the last act of all these conventions was, who's the vice presidential nominee going to be? And Edward Moore is the campaign manager for Cox, and he reached Cox, who was at his home in Ohio, and said, look, who are you interested in as potential for your vice president? And he said, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Moore asked him, well, do you know Roosevelt? And he said, no, in fact, I didn't. In fact, so far as I knew, I'd never even seen him. But I explained to Mr. Moore that he met the geographical requirement, he was recognized as an independent, and that Roosevelt was a well-known name. That was good enough for him. That made it good enough for the convention, who nominated Roosevelt the next day on the first ballot. Well, Roosevelt then went off to Ohio to meet with Cox, confer with the candidate. The two of them then went to Washington to meet with the president, Woodrow Wilson, to kind of get his support. They were shocked at the physical condition of Wilson, who had barely been seeing anybody. He was paralyzed on the left side, kind of a shell of his former self. But he got a smile on his face when he's talking to Cox and FDR, because they were committed to push the League of Nations during this campaign. Very much a contrast with Warren Harding, who would only support the League with the reservations that the Senate had offered that were complete non-starter to Woodrow Wilson. So very different perspectives on Wilson's key topic. Roosevelt, an active campaigner in this, he accepted the nomination formally at his home in Hyde Park, traveled to 32 states over the next 3 months. Louis Howe was his campaign manager. He added Steve Early was his advance man. The press aide was Marvin McIntyre, and he brought in a new assistant, Marguerite LeHand, signed on at $35 a week. None of this mattered because the nation was ready for change. 1920 election was really still all about Woodrow Wilson, and frankly, it was a repudiation of Wilson in the last couple of years of his presidency. Harding won kind of in a landslide. To commemorate the experience, though, Franklin Roosevelt, always staying optimistic, had some gold cufflinks made. And on one of the cufflinks for each pair was FDR. On the other was the initial of the people who were really in his inner circle from his camp on this. They became known as the Cufflink Gang, an informal support group for Roosevelt that would come together around Roosevelt's birthday every year, basically for the rest of his life. Roosevelt accepted defeat. He knew the sentiment of the country. This was more about Woodrow Wilson than it was about anything that he and Cox were potentially up for. First national campaign, invaluable experience, made a lot of connections, still a young man. No doubt for Franklin Roosevelt, a lot more to come. But it would be a very circuitous route back to the top of the political food chain for Franklin Roosevelt. He was about to suffer a health setback that no one anticipated, but that is the story for another day. That is Franklin Roosevelt and marriage, evolution, and first national campaign from the life of Franklin Roosevelt. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher. This is Presidential Chronicles.